the fifth panel of the conference. And during this panel, we're going to be talking about resilience and kind of rebuilding for resilience. And I guess for many people, the title of the panel seems a bit broad. It's not as specific as the rest, but it's intentionally designed this way in order to be able to talk about sustainability across the various systems and explore what it means for these various systems that we live and operate in to be resilient and why that matters. So without further ado, we have our three esteemed panelists here with us. We have Ali Al-Mubayad, we have Noura Salim, and we have Faisal Gattan. So I'll give a brief introduction about each of our speakers, and then we can go ahead and dive straight into the content. So Ms. Ali Al-Mubayad is Managing Director for Emerging Europe, Middle East, and Africa for research at Jefferies. Prior to this role, Alia was a Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, after spending 9 years as MENA Chief Economist at Barclays, focusing on economics and geopolitics of the Middle East. Before that, she worked as Senior Economist at the World Bank and held various economic research and policy responsibilities in Lebanon, in charge of macroeconomic and trade policies prior to that. Alia holds a BA in Economics and an MBA from AUB, the American University of Beirut, and studied public policy at the École Nationale d'Administration, sorry for mispronouncing that, in France. She's the founder of the Association of Women in Economics across the Middle East and North Africa, aimed at promoting the role of women in economic policymaking in the region. Noura Salim has been the Executive Director of the Sawiris Foundation for Social Development since 2015. It is a grant-making family foundation that's been operational for 20 years in Egypt and focuses on funding programs that promote youth employment and quality education. Prior to that, Noura worked at McKinsey & Company in New York, Dubai, and Egypt, serving clients within the public and private sectors on topics within healthcare and education. Noura holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a master's in biotechnology from the University of Pennsylvania. Noura has been appointed to the advisory board of Harvard Business School Middle East and North Africa and was also selected from the World Economic Forum as a Young Global Leader for 2019. Noura has served as chairwoman of the Arab Foundations Forum and has joined the C20 Engagement Group as a member of the International Advisory Committee. And last but surely not least, we have Faisal Gattan, who currently works at Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Economy and Planning, where he serves as the Assistant Deputy Minister for Labor Market Policies and Human Capital Development, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Sustainable Development Affairs, and advisor to the Minister of Economy and Planning. Faisal works on a wide range of social and economic policies covering areas such as social protection, poverty and inequality, human capital and population development, family planning, and labor market dynamics. He also serves on a number of boards, such as the Saudi Arabian Real Estate Development Fund, Human Resource Development Fund, General Organization for Social Insurance, and Family Affairs Council. Prior to joining the Ministry of Economy and Planning, Faisal worked for the Brookings Institution, the OECD, the Gulf Research Center, and the Queen Rania Foundation. Faisal holds a master's degree in Arab Studies from Georgetown University, a master's degree in Economics and Public Policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor's degree in Economics and Finance from the American University of Cairo. So welcome, everyone. I'm sure there's going to be a rich conversation. So we can, so I think the way I'd like to frame this is just to say, so when we think about sustainability, right? So long-term sustainability in MENA and elsewhere requires effective and efficient capital development, and I think human capital development, right? Now, while development goals can be set high and ambitiously, they can also be impeded due to existing systems being either archaic, ill-designed, rigid, or maybe a combination of these factors. And in the wake of certain external shocks, so as we've recently seen, so you have COVID, the Port of Beirut explosion, most recently the war in Ukraine, etc., we notice that factors and design flaws in existing systems emerge clearly and requiring kind of an urgent and close examination of their institutions, their policies and governance to redesign them with resilience, enabling social and economic development for a sustainable future. So maybe as a starting point here, I could pose the question, or maybe lay the groundwork and ask, kind of for a common understanding or a common language in this conversation. When we speak about resilience or resilient systems, from the vantage points that you either work or research in, what does that mean to you? We can start alphabetically, maybe. Ali, you'd like to start? Please feel free. Or
Sure. First, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. Very interesting discussion. I mean, I'm an economist, and I would like to talk about how I look, but how I define and what economic resilience means to me. And I think even more so in this particular period where we are, where the severity of the crisis that is gripping the global economy, at least for the last 2 years since the inception or the COVID outbreak, is clearly unprecedented and has put a lot of strains on a lot of the systems, and particularly in our region, and has prompted us to have a new thinking about the concept and nature of economic growth, with really increasing attention to the issues of sustainability and economic resilience. And for me, if I want to just like capture resilience, economic resilience in one sentence, I would say with economic resilience is for me the ability of an economy to adapt both to shocks and to long-term changes, and to be ready to withstand them over time. And so for me, this is how I look when I analyze as an economist whether an economy is resilient or not. Is it able to withstand and adapt to shocks, and to also have enough flexible and ability to adapt to these long-term changes that are facing us, and we will get to speak about them. I mean, I think it is very clear to me as a citizen of the world, but mainly as an economist, that there are significant risks that are facing us. I mean, and these may not come from one source, like, for example, what we have seen have come as a source from the pandemic, but they could be also a confluence and a combination of risks and shocks that can come together, and that could challenge the resilience of a given economy. But also more so the context in which we are. I mean, our economies, particularly in the MENA region, are facing the high level of debt burdens, particularly in oil importing countries, or they have very weak institutions because of relatively weak governance. But also the scale and the scope of the green transition that is incumbent upon many of us, and particularly oil exporters. All of these cybersecurity threats because of geopolitical rivalries, all of these are going to create important shocks and strains, and are going to challenge our economic fundamentals, be it in the public sectors, institutions, or also in the private sector. And our ability to adapt, face, and these shock, and put together the policies required for adapting to long-term changes is what for me defines economic resilience.
thank you.
Thank you, Salman, and thank you for the MIT sort of Tech Arabia group for organizing this. I'm very honored to participate. I think your question is great, Salman, actually, about the definition of resilience, because I think this term is often can be quite wide, and it loses its sort of scientific designation as to what we exactly mean. And I think the standard definition that many economists use, the way Ali described it, is its ability to respond to shocks. The way I think about it, as someone who is an economist that works on poverty alleviation and social protection, I think about it from the level of the household. And for me, a system, or when we talk about systems, I think about families or a collection of families that inhabit a particular space, and the various types of characteristics that they face. So that for me is how I think about resilience and systems. It's an amalgamation of many households and individuals that live in a particular community and sort of interact with one another and produce output and try to consume and try to improve their well-being over time. And from there, I think that's the question where the friability or the susceptibility that people have to these types of shocks becomes a little bit more apparent. For me, as someone that tries to examine the drivers of poverty or the correlates of poverty, you can already tell at a very early stage, families that will not be as resilient. These are families that typically, for example, have lower levels of education, for instance, or their household structures are quite sizable, and experience health issues across the spectrum, whether it's chronic illnesses like diabetes or other forms of or other very serious illnesses like cancer or other types of things that really put a burden on the household, and those are how we identify high risk families that require some sort of intervention, and that's how we really think about resilience. I think what Alia was talking about is a fantastic way to think about the long-term sort of view of how we should think about resilience. But I think recently what has been making its way into the conversation is, okay, from year to year, what are these families dealing with? Are they saving? Are they not saving? Will they be able to weather a storm? Yes or no? And I think what I'll conclude with is, I think a very big part of what's happening, at least from the ministry's view, is you need to break the economy down into groups. I think you obviously have lower income segments of the population that exhibit particular characteristics and behaviors, and this can be attributable to a certain group. But you also really need to start thinking about the middle group or the middle class, and what their features are and how they can withstand certain shocks should they arise. And then, of course, you have the higher income groups that that have also other types of characteristics. So resilience has to be grounded in these ideas, and each group exhibits different forms of risks, and as it pertains to resilience in that sense.
Thank you, Faisal.
Thank you, Salman, and thank you to the MIT team for having us. And it's really a pleasure to be with Alia and Faisal today. So perhaps I'd like to bring in, the civil society organizations perspective, given sort of my world of nonprofits. And perhaps I want to start, and this is a bit more simplistic than the fact, but I'd also want to start with making the distinction within civil society organizations between, the different spectrum, because I think when we talk about resilience, it looks very different when you talk about traditional charities, which I think are in the MENA region prevalent, historic. And when you talk about development organizations, which sort of sit somewhere in the middle, depending on their sectorial focus, be it, whether they work on education, healthcare, youth employment, etc., and then rights-based organizations. And, if we think of those three classifications, I would say that generally you see that traditional charities perhaps, have an easier enabling environment to operate in, perhaps appear more resilient. Development organizations sort of sit in the middle, depending on their sectorial focus. And then you have, I think, rights-based organizations where perhaps I think there are more challenges around their resilience. And with that, I don't want to add to the definitions that Alia and Faisal said, because I think from a pure resilience definition, I think this also applies to civil society, right? Their ability to be agile, adapt, their ability to respond to shocks. And I would actually say that, civil society is, as we saw in COVID, as we saw with a lot of crises, tends to be one of the first responders. But I think what I would like to highlight is when I look at the resilience of, particularly as a donor organization, we work with a lot of NGOs. For NGOs, for the civil society sector to be resilient, I think it needs to be, one, have the right enabling regulatory environment. And I think this varies across the region. And there's always this tension and this balance between, I think, the recognition of public sector, private sector, of the importance of civil society, but also this balance between, trust, and I'll get to that later. So that's one that I think is critical when we talk about their resilience. And then the second is the ability to have the right resources. And the right resources, definitely there's, around funding. And so I think that you see a lot of civil society organizations struggle with their resilience and their sustainability due to the short-term nature of funding, particularly when we talk about, a lot of foreign funding in that space that's not necessarily, aimed at being long-term. Human resources, again, a sector that historically doesn't necessarily attract talent. Perhaps this is changing, but definitely I'd love to see, in the MENA region and globally, civil society being able to attract a lot more talent, for young people to see that there's a career path for them in nonprofits. And then I'd like to close with just being evidence-based, because I also think that when we look at nonprofits and when we look at civil society organizations, particularly given that our region, you have sadaqa, waqf, like all the sort of traditional forms of giving, I think have always been there. But then the move to very professional philanthropic organizations is relatively nascent, right? But what this has meant is that a lot of the structure of the whole sector is geared around intentions. So the sector is moving towards understanding that development is a science, that, actually when you talk and when you work on such big topics like poverty alleviation, that Faisal touched on, ending hunger, gender equality, you can only, be resilient and be able to have impact if you are working off of an evidence-based, if you are designing programs that are, that you're going to measure, that you're going to track, that you're going to report on, versus just, we're all good intentioned and we're all going to design, like nice things and send children to school. Is that what is really needed? And so for me, just to summarize, I think a resilient civil society is one that is evidence-based, is one that has access to sufficient resources, financial resources, human resources, and is one that then, can sustain through shocks and can adapt, as Alia and Faisal said.
Fantastic. Thanks, Noura. Thank you all. I think that's it's a great starting point for the conversation. And I'm thinking, as I'm hearing you all speak, I hope as the conversation evolves, we can touch on some nodes of intersectionality as well between the worlds that you occupy, because they definitely, if not overlap, but intersect in key areas. And just, so I think I'll go a little bit off script actually here. So thinking back to our opening keynote speaker yesterday, Dr. Omar Razaz, one of the things he spoke a lot on about is the importance of institutions, and how, to his mind, sustainability or institutions are part and parcel really of sustainability. And one could argue that could be an obvious point, but not necessarily in our region, maybe in other places in the world where there are much more developed systems where institutions are at their core. And, here, maybe as Noura mentioned, you have sometimes folks or categories of groups operating on intention. The problem is once those folks are out of the picture, so goes the work. And then you have on the other end, let's say, institutions headed by very, let's say, strong-willed individuals who kind of push through. And I think that's how a lot of work has also been done. I mean, from your different vantage points, can you speak a little bit to kind of your assessment of the relevance or importance, or, well, importance is known, but maybe a diagnostic on the state of institutions as you see them? Well, let me start with that, and then we can maybe unpack further.
I mean, I am biased for what Dr. Razaz said. I mean, and I'm very much actually influenced by him. I used to be a young professional when he was at the World Bank, and he's one of the most important people I've looked up to when I was working at the World Bank, and I think. Essentially, what we learn when we are in development and trying to work with governments to help them achieve better development outcomes is that the only way to do it is, and to do it in a sustainable fashion, is when you are able to build strong institutions and systems that can basically be developed. And when I say systems and institutions, we mean basically not only agile, but competent and responsive. And I think if there is one thing that we've learned more recently through the COVID pandemic, is that a responsive public sector and government institution to protect society and to make sure that basically that the fallout of such a huge shock on the economy is minimized requires a very competent and responsive public sector, and I think this is important for a global debate, but also in our region, where we always think, okay, should we really downsize the public sector, or should we privatize, or do we want less government and more government? Actually, no. What we want is actually a responsive public sector and quality institutions that are also accountable for the citizens, for the citizenry. And I think resilience, is now in a post-pandemic world is a public good, and it is the responsibility of the state. And it has to, and you need this to be delivered through a robust public sector with resources to make the necessary investment, provide the complementary services, but also to coordinate these multiple activities that building resilience involves. And you cannot do it if you do not have the resources for these institutions to work. And if I look again as an economist on the state of finances of Arab economies, for example, I mean, also here we have two regions at multiple speeds, right? You have the haves in a world of plenty and of higher oil prices, the oil exporters who have solid balance sheets and have also come to develop a rapid response. If I look at Saudi Arabia, at the UAE, for example, while others that are more saddled with debt, that have lower quality institutions, and mainly these are in oil importers. Institutions have very limited margin of maneuver to deliver on these response to shocks and build resiliency. I mean, look at Lebanon. It's in a default and a complete state of dilapidation of its institution because its institutions are captured by basically corrupt elite and powers that be in terms of militia, etc. But also you have weak institutions, strong institutions in Tunisia, but a mismanagement of the resources that made Tunisia now about to face a crisis. Also, you could argue that institutions where citizens do not have enough voice, for example, like in Egypt, mainly also could not be as conducive as they are, even when institutions of the state are functioning quite robustly because of a relatively authoritarian regime. So again, I mean, I think we really have a diversity in terms of the state of institutions in our regions, but there is no doubt that our focus on building them to be more responsive, accountable, and reflecting citizens' voices is critical for the future.
Absolutely, thank you. Faisal or Noura, would you like to add anything?
Noura, do you want to jump in or?
Please go ahead first. It's fine.
So no, this topic of institutions, we've been talking about it for maybe 4 or 5 years now in government, and the Minister of Economy and Planning in specific is very keen on how can we strengthen institutions. I think this idea is very, very important, and it dates back to the works of Acemoglu and Robinson, the book about like why nations fail, and this was a huge discussion, I think back in 2015, 2013, where we were talking about, what determines what. Do political institutions determine economic institutions or vice versa? And I think for the most part, I think where we fall, and of course they agree with a lot of the points that Alia just brought up, but I think what's becoming very evident is that populism and political structures in European and other Western contexts are showing that perhaps the best way to frame or to formulate economic policies is perhaps not through this populist lens, and one needs to take a step back and really think about what the medium and long-term consequences of some of these decisions are. And there's a lot of discussions now about how can we revive or re-examine the core democratic principles that exist in Western and European contexts in order to bring about a better sort of outcome. I think I agree with Ali's assessment in general about the nature of institutions in the Middle East and just in general. I mean, the problem that we have in the Middle East is that I think there's this underlying assumption that we are somehow similar but in reality, we are extremely different. I mean, I have to say this, and I think, and I know Ali agrees with this, and we've had conversations about this, but the heterogeneity that exists between these Arab countries is very extreme, and grouping us together as to somehow, we're supposed to exhibit, similar behaviors like the Europeans or some other, other grouping is bizarre and not helpful, to be quite honest. Even, and it's always presented in a way of like of 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 uncontrolled chaos and destruction, that this is going on here and we can't control ourselves, and this is going on here, so by virtue of this, we conclude that the Arab world looks like this. And I can only really speak from the Saudi perspective. I've lived in parts of the Middle East, but my experience is very Saudi centric. And there was this moment of transition where I was there for when the institutions were a little bit, let's say, in the pre-phase, and or pre-development phase, and now we're really trying to strengthen our institutions. And there's always trade-offs with these kinds of things, because we're trying to achieve this very ambitious vision, Vision 2030, which was launched many years ago. And in order for us to get there, I mean, regardless of what anyone says, whether it's KPIs or whatever, it really does rely on institutions that are self-sufficient and sustainable and require a lot of thinking and analysis. And I think what Noura said about evidence-based policies, I think is 100% true. And I would even go as far as to say that we often say evidence-based policies, but there's also something about policy-based evidence that needs to also seep into our minds, is that these questions are, it's very important that we start thinking about the policy questions first, and what kinds of outcomes we want to see, and how we can assemble information in good ways. I think I'll conclude this point about institutions. It's a very important discussion, but I think accountability, right? I mean, institutions in and of themselves are institutions, but I think one of the things that we are learning in government, in Saudi Arabia in particular, is the importance of holding institutions accountable to the things that they are saying, and why they are saying them, and how they are saying them, and how did they arrive at these particular conclusions. What I found is that just public debates, and by public debates I mean within within government, right? Like forums where we can debate, go back and forth with civil society and the private sector, and those, just to see what the reaction would be, or how are people going to internalize and view these kinds of things, is something that's very important. I think accountability doesn't always have to be thought of through like a Western lens. There are other ways that we can get to accountability, and we're trying to explore those ideas. And it comes through public debates, discourse, and being very critical of one another. And this is something that we're seeing in government now for the first time. I will say this, that over the past 3 years, different ministries have interacted and debated and disagreed, and I think that's very healthy, and it brings about better outcomes in the for long term.
Absolutely. Thanks, Faisal.
If I can just add one point, I mean, I definitely agree with the two key points that I think both Alia and Faisal mentioned around, responsiveness and around accountability when we talk about institutions. And I just want to add two more. And again, even within institutions, I'm thinking of, strong civil society organizations that are institutionalized. And so one is data. Again, I think that it's, even when you talk about accountability, how are you going to be accountable if there isn't data that is being collected, data that is being analyzed critically, data that is being published and shared, right? Whether this is, government side, civil society themselves, private sector, whoever, right? Like all the different stakeholders that are operating within the sphere of, development of our economies. And so, and for me, it was interesting with a meeting with the Egyptian Minister of Social Solidarity recently. We're not there yet, but at least I was happy to hear her perspective, where she said, data in Egypt. I'm not gonna say MENA now anymore, Faisal, but data in Egypt. She used to say, data was haram. And, at least now as a government, we're hoping to make data a bit more halal and, share more with civil society, right? And, is all data shared with civil society? No. Is all data even collected? No. Are there sensitivities? Yes. But I want to say that it's both ways. So I look at civil society organizations, and nonprofits don't share hardly any data, right? And I will, given my Arab Foundations Forum hat, I will say across the MENA region with confidence, nonprofits do not share data. And you ask them, how much funding did you get this year? And they look at you like you're asking about their personal salary. Well, what did you do with the funding? Oh, look at the pictures of the nice boys that are in school. Yes, but how many, right? How many did you educate with that? What outcomes did you measure? Has their educational, outcomes improved? What KPIs are you tracking? So I think just data, when we talk about any kind of institution, is really critical. I understand. So, not to again simplify it, that even data collection itself and doing that, appropriately, accurately, Alia as an economist, I'm sure knows a lot more than me, is something that is not easy. So Sawiris Foundation, we've been working with Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab for many years now, doing randomized control trials over a number of our development programs. And we work with top tier researchers. And I can see how difficult it is to collect quality data, from grassroots, like in Upper Egypt, with poor family, like it's very complex. So I don't undermine that it requires a lot of resources, a lot of expertise, a lot of time. We did an RCT, took 4 years to get any results, right? And so it's very time intensive. Then the second point that I want to leave with is transparency. So even if you were to collect, even how are you going to be accountable if we are not transparent? And again, and this is something that, we as Sawiris Foundation, we care very much about our own transparency, our own publication of any data that we collect, but taking our partner organizations along. We work through NGOs. And so we at least try to encourage, and it was something that, through the Arab Foundations Forum, we were trying to do with member foundations is, please, can you be transparent? Please, can you publish at least, some high level data that gives an indication? And then that allows, and I'll close with that allows, to the point that Ali made, coordination. So again, if we're not sharing any data, if we're not being transparent, then how do you expect to coordinate between even just among civil society organizations? But then, because we all overlap, right? At the end of the day, we're all working on national agendas similar to, the Saudi strategy 2030. I mean, you have Egypt Vision 2030, right? That CSOs are working on, that the government is working on, that the private sector is contributing to. If I don't know where you're working, what you're doing, what you're collecting, how are we really going to, maximize on our synergies, complement each other, operate where we can best operate? Thank you.
Thanks, Nora. I think this is, oh man, my mind is like firing in all directions. It's going to be hard to stay focused. Okay, so, but I'll try to keep things tight. So I guess building on that, so we talked about, so institutions are a key for sustainable development. And even within institutions, right, you need data to drive policies and maybe policies to try and pin down outcomes that we want to work towards. I guess, so are there other key factors or key elements that you think are really integral to sort of sustain development? And what resistance do you see on the ground today to getting there? So if element X needs to be in place, why do you think it's not in place today? Yeah. I mean, I know there are tons of historical factors for why we are where we are today, but maybe you can go back as far as you'd like historically, but we can maybe focus a bit on the present day as well.
Do you guys mind if I jump in on this one? So thanks. So look, I think, Salman, that's a great question. And I was thinking about it actually very recently about what are the major sort of things that are preventing us from getting to this outcome. I mean, Ali presented it very nicely in the beginning. We're a country that, yes, there is scarcity, but the threshold is quite high. I mean, we have a lot of options and our fiscal space is quite good. And so I do a lot of work, like I was saying, on social protection and trying to alleviate poverty and inequality in segments of Saudi Arabia. So I think there are two questions for me that are very important. One, or dimensions that I think are very important. So one is dealing with the baggage. So I came into this position that I'm in now, and one of the most important laws that I wanted to change, and Noura brought up, the Ministry of Social Solidarity. Ghada Wali is someone that I, admire and I respect, and she helped me a lot when I was working in my position. We worked a lot on reforming the social safety net in Saudi Arabia, and that law was done in the 1960s and was there for decades. I mean, almost half of a century. Essentially, it's been there, and no significant changes have been made to that law. And that comes with, ideology and cultural sort of norms and principles that become ingrained in the way that we think about vulnerability and poverty in Saudi Arabia. And I would also say in the GCC, I mean, we borrowed these ideas of categorical based targeting from a common idea that that widows and divorcees and orphans or whatever are inherently poor or inherently vulnerable, which is not always the case, right? And I think the move from categorical targeting to means-based targeting with incentives has become like a very big hallmark of that law, that it took us almost 4 years to get through the door, and it was passed maybe almost a year ago. And so that was a big part of it, is that you really have to not just jump over the baggage or what has been there for many years. You have to confront that problem and really try to unpack the contours of that problem and try to really explore and unpack the parameters so that you know exactly what you're dealing with. And it took us, the team, I mean, we were maybe 50 people working on this at one time, visiting different parts of Saudi Arabia, talking to the program administrators and really trying to say to them, listen, you're not getting to where you need to be. You're not targeting the right people, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one big piece that I think is very important, is that for a lot of us, yes, we have the privileges that we have. We've all, studied at very good institutions. I think we come into these positions thinking that we know all of the answers, but in reality, you have to take a step back and say, okay, I have the methods and the tools. I need to sort of co-create and solve with these people what these problems need to look like, or the solutions, what they need to look like. So that's one piece. And then the second piece, and I've been reading a lot about this recently. There's a book that was published less than a month ago by John List called The Voltage Effect. And in this book, he talks about the importance of scalability and what are the challenges that we face when it comes to scalability, about trying to unpack false positives and trying to understand if your idea has the potential to scale up to the national level. And he goes into a number of details. There's 5 ingredients. I can't remember them all right now, but there's these ideas that are markers for whether or not your idea will scale or not. I think sometimes we have the tendency of seeing one idea work in one context and say, okay, let's apply this at the national level and it'll work. And what I've done, like what I've really tried to do internally within the ministry, is say, okay, let's pilot and let's aggressively pilot, like not just 1 or 2, but let's try to really make it difficult for us to replicate the results that we observed in that first study, and really try to see if these ideas work before you roll it out and you take up people's time and effort and resources. Really try to examine whether or not this idea can scale or not. So those are my 2 ideas or challenges. One is that the cultural and the ideological baggage that exists prior to an intervention, because that is very real and significant. And then the second one is this idea of scalability and piloting as being your best tools or best friends when you're trying to figure out whether a program will work or not.
Fantastic. This actually, I hate to put you on the spot, Nora, but I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I think we had spoken about this kind of briefly, but I think this is like a natural segue. We were speaking about evidence-based policy, right? Or essentially setting up programs and then being very specific about the kind of interlinkage of the different variables within a program, a system, and what have you. And I know you do a lot of, or Sawida's foundation does a lot of on-the-ground work, kind of vocational training, et cetera. And, can you speak a little bit about kind of from your vantage point, kind of what the experience has been in terms of developing, let's say, efficient and effective programs with this mindset?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Faisal. It was very insightful what you said. And I, as I was listening to you, and I will answer your questions, Salman, but as I was listening to you, I think one thing that came to my mind is also the importance, which you mentioned, even when you're going to different places in Saudi, and understanding that, the programs will have to be different depending on where you're operating, and thus the need to really be aggressively piloting. But the whole idea of being, very grassroots driven and bottoms up driven as well, because I think that we come from our ivory towers in a way. And I see that a lot in development, World Bank, IFIs, etc., European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We all come at tons of foreign funding, a lot of different agendas, all, again, very well intentioned, and come and assume that we all know better, right? We all know better what those families need. We know, why they're going to now use family control. We know now why they're going to send their kids to children. I'm going to come with this perfectly designed program that you couldn't think of because clearly I'm like, I've thought more about this and I've had a better education. And I love, and so I will recommend this. I'll do a plug for it. You guys are MIT, so I guess that's a good thing. Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo's book, Poor Economics. I loved the book. And I precisely loved when he was saying, that the poor are no less rational than anyone else. And actually, because they have so little, they kind of have to be sophisticated economists just to survive. And I think that this book really shifted a lot of my thinking, or really crystallized as a development practitioner, the real importance of taking the time and the humility to listen and to understand that maybe, the design that we're thinking about might really not be the best design for the different families, depending on whether you're working on poverty, education, whatever else. So that's just the point that I wanted to make. Even to your point on programming, Salman, and how do you design effective, I think it starts by being very participatory and by listening to those that you're supposed to be serving and ensuring that you are assuming their at least relative rationality of their own needs. So I would say this is key consideration for design. And then I would say the second is understanding the multidimensionality. And I appreciate that now the conversation, even about poverty, is about multidimensional poverty. It's not about monetary poverty. And unless you understand that there is a huge interlinkage, we talk about vocational training, you talk about education, you talk about employment, we work a lot also in early childhood development. And now we understand how early childhood development, availing of nurseries, availing of quality nurseries, huge, determinant of female labor force participation that you want to work on. And you wonder, why female labor force participation, whether because nurseries themselves employ a lot of women or also because they enable women to then be able to go to the workplace. And so I think, again, understanding the complexity of the issues that governments and, civil society work on, and taking that multidimensionality into account as you are designing is really critical. And the last point I want to make is then, given those two things, ensuring that you're really working with the right set of partners. So I will say that I don't think we would be able to design, impactful, or at least initiatives that have a higher likelihood of being impactful, without working with the grassroots civil society organizations, researchers like the ones at JPAL, potentially others. I'll say JPAL because, MIT, but really it's been an exceptional experience, because you both leverage the existing knowledge that they already have of what works and what doesn't elsewhere, but then you can contextualize it to the context that you're operating in, and other funders. Because lastly, I think that if we want to be impactful, and this is a very civil society specific problem, but I just want to leave with that, we suffer, I think, in the nonprofit space with a very restricted short-term nature of funding. And unless funding for nonprofit organizations shifts, and thus I would love to see sort of more Arab funding in philanthropy, not towards charity, but really towards development, because a lot of that is largely ODA, is largely foreign funding, that can sustain and that can understand that you need to not just give restricted funding for particular activities, but you also need to give unrestricted funding to actually build the capacities of the organizations that are implementing on the ground, such that you're able to have sustainable change for the communities that you're serving.
Thank you, Noura. I have a comment there, but let me see if Alia, you have anything you'd like to add.
I just wanted, on your question on what works and what, what elements are working in order to improve or support economic resiliency and what is working less. I think, and building on what was said earlier, I think for me, because I cover the region and I analyze basically economic policy frameworks across the Arab region, I think what I can definitely say that there is what is not working well is the evidence-based policy making. Not generally, because I agree with Faisal. I think we have seen an important and fundamental shift in the Gulf on embracing and adopting more evidence-based policymaking. Now, okay, well, you could tell me that this is with the help of international consultants, but I can definitely vouch that as long as locals are working hand in hand with international consultants, then we are building capacity for local evidence-based policymaking, as we are seeing with Faisal and his colleagues. And we see this interestingly also in Oman today. I mean, you see, for example, in terms of public finances, okay, I mean, stress and crisis has pushed a lot of these countries to embrace a more evidence-based policy approach to policy, but at least it is happening and it is being institutionalized. It's not yet only a reaction, but an adjustment. So this is how I am looking. Now, when people tell me, why are you so positive about Oman? Well, I tell them because they are building institutions, they are building medium-term fiscal policy frameworks, and they are being transparent about it. And that brings me to my second point of what also is starting to work, but is not yet fully working to build resilience. I mean, increasingly with youth constituting, I mean, more than half our societies, and with the interconnected, open, social media-driven world that we are, it is extremely difficult to devise policy and implement it without being inclusive through the decision-making process. I mean, you need people to embrace these paths to policy in order to make sure that when you are implementing them, you are actually, there will not be a reversal of these policies, right? Again, a good example is what has been done in terms of the VAT in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the decision was made, but there was a consultation with the private sector to some extent, and there was an explanation, a communication by why it is important to have it. It is painful, it's going to be inflationary, but I mean, this is part of a bigger puzzle. So consultation is very important. I mean, it may not be perfect all the time, but I think it is essential. And we see the danger of not doing so, right? Like, for example, in Tunisia, previous examples of IMF program where there were not enough consultation of labor unions, civil society, but even, I mean, close coordination between the different parts of government and the private sector, we have seen basically the path of policy implementation to be very difficult and then leading into crisis and underperformance on development outcomes. So inclusivity and consultation is extremely important to be able to make people not only to make those who are making the policies more accountable, but also those who are bearing the brunt of those policies responsible for it, because they feel that they have participated in developing those policies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And it's interesting because I feel a lot of the things we're talking about are kind of coalescing. And I want to say, and I feel like these things have to evolve hand in hand, like the institutionalization of, let's say, a system has to go, hand in hand with it not being it takes it away from being a one-man kind of centralized thing to a semi-dispersed system of elements with clear roles and responsibilities. And I think only with that clarity and disaggregation a little bit can you then also hold each element accountable, right? And then you hold them accountable by setting the metrics and what have you, but also, as you rightly mentioned, before setting the target trajectory, you also have to be inclusive and bring in the voices of folks upon whose shoulders this will fall, whether to get buy-in or to figure out workarounds. But in any case, to keep the resistance at bay. I think we might be running over time. If you allow me to maybe ask one or two more questions, are you okay on time? Because I know this was the scheduled slot we had. Okay, great. Let's say ask one more question that I have on my list, which actually not referred to at all. And then we can take a question from the audience, and then we can go ahead and wrap up. So I guess the last question is kind of bigger picture, but what mistakes from the past, do you think were kind of key in bringing us where we are, and you know, what do you think we can learn from them and hopefully avoid?
Question, Salman, you mean like what things have we done in the past or that we regret, or sorry, my bad.
They can be things you regret or things you don't regret, but they can, I mean, essentially, are there any key themes, I guess, beyond which the ones we've already talked about? Because I know this was also pretty comprehensive in identifying kind of the big roadblocks to, let's say, a resilient next step. But are there any other factors that you think we haven't touched upon, things that were done in the past? And the answer could be no, but just wondering if there's anything we've missed.
There's a part, I mean, so I've known Alia for a long time, and she was a part of this group that used to come and ask us questions about on her visits to the kingdom about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and these kinds of things, right? And so a lot of the things that she's saying right now were points that we've always thought about, right? And knew that, okay, do we need to do this consultation and we need to talk about those kinds of things? What I've learned, I mean, just bringing back this point that you guys were raising, right? I think you have to be very careful when you're doing these consultations that you're not doing them for the sake of just doing them. You have to go in with, like, we're not ticking a box here, right? That we sat with, 6 people, and those 6 people are, our friends, and they basically just, repeated what we've all known because we're going to give them kickbacks or some sort of benefit, blah, blah, blah. You have to be very intentional, right? About, what it was. I don't want to talk too much about the VAT because there's a lot of sort of issues with that topic, so I won't touch that one. But sometimes the prescription or the intervention or whatever it is that you want to call it is sometimes very painful, and people will never support you regardless of how you present it. They will never be on your side, and they'll always say, listen, we're a rich country, and we don't have to worry about these issues. سيب على ربنا خلاص الأسعار ارتفعت, everything is fine kind of situation. That stuff I think we're not taking anymore, and at least when people say these things to me, I don't even register this kind of like pushback. But I think a big part of it, Salman, that you raised, and you and I have had these conversations in the past, is that, and very much what Noura said as well, the private sector isn't inherently great, and the civil society and its organizations are not inherently great. Everyone, and the government, right? Everyone needs to be held accountable to the things that they are saying and the work that they are doing, and no one has like a free card to do whatever it is that they want, because actions and decisions of certain organizations, I mean, Naguib Sawiris and the Sawiris Foundation, the coverage that they have is extensive, right? So the decisions that they make carry a lot of weight on social policy questions, on economic policies. So there is a stake in the game, and we have that same environment here, right? Where you have to really be purposeful and really think about the questions that you want to ask them. Because I don't go in and say, do you guys like it if we increase VAT to X amount? I mean, obviously they're going to say no, but you have to ask them different kinds of questions. And I never participated in the VAT discussions. I give people money, but I don't take it away. So these kinds of ideas about how can we? I think it comes back to this question of, okay, I'm going to give you this money this month. What are you going to do with it? How much are you going to put it here? How much are you going to do here? And what risks do you face? I mean, those kinds of questions are very interesting. And I think one of the most, I'm an economist as well, and Alia knows that I'm very curious about these kinds of questions. But what I did a couple of years ago was I did these vignettes, these qualitative vignettes, where I had a social worker visit a family, 20 families in Saudi Arabia scattered all over, and they stayed with them for 2 weeks. And they lived with them day to day and tried to chronicle every moment and every significant expenditure and process that they went through, just to sort of figure out what was going on within that house. And that was probably the most illuminating thing that like the most illuminating exercise, that's consultation for me, right? Not bringing people in a room and everyone randomly starts going, because I think what Alia said as well, and she was talking about Lebanon, about the issues and challenges that they're facing. It's bringing people to consultations is a privilege, and it's a selection, and there's a process there that you need to be very cautious about, because it's not representative. I think one of the things that we often do is that we have this like false sense of representation when we're doing these consultations. Like, yes, we met with everyone in the private sector, but in reality you met with 3 or 4 people, and you can't generalize off of that. So that's been my lesson, right? Is that be very careful when you generalize uh, policy inferences when you have a very skewed sample. I think that's been something that is very problematic for me. And the ideas of consultations, I mean, it is something that we do, but I don't just do it now where everyone sits around a table and we're all like randomly throwing that. No, like there's a survey, I need you guys to fill this in, tell me like very specific thought. That kind of stuff is what's going on, at least in the area that I'm working on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Faisal.
If I can just make a quick follow-up on things, on lessons learned also, and I think this, in general, as again in the realm of economics, and given that we live in a world of scarcity, and that, as I mentioned, I mean, we're faced with all these shocks and risks. I think one thing we don't do well, particularly in the Arab world, again, but at various degree, is try to explain to the population that that every decision, in every policy decision, sometimes or most of the time, it involves a policy trade-off, so that we have to lose something, we gain somewhere and we lose somewhere else. Often we tend to present one narrative to our populations and make them believe this narrative for a long time, and maybe also partly because, as Faisal and Nora said, because sometimes our anthropological context, I mean, makes it so much linked to personality. Decisions are personality driven rather than evidence based, etc. But I think what makes policy systems more resilient to shocks is when populations understand that they chose this as a policy because it was better than another alternative that would have costed them more, or in which they would have gained less. And a very good example, again, I can give it from in Lebanon, right? I mean, what is the main cause of the problem and of the crisis in Lebanon is that for 30 years, we have convinced the Lebanese that pegging the exchange rate is the best thing to do, even when you are running large twin deficits that are unsustainable. No one came to explain to the population of Lebanon 10 years ago that if we could have liberalized the exchange rate like they did in Egypt after the Saura, even if it would have entailed higher inflation and some shock, but maybe the devaluation would have gone from 1,500 to 3,000. But now, because we kept on pegging the exchange rate, we've amassed $70 billion of losses in the system. There is no ceiling to where the exchange rate can deteriorate. So if people understood this trade-off in terms of what they have to win and lose, maybe they would have gone and said, yeah, maybe you should have liberalized the exchange rate 10 years ago. So just to give you an example, I mean, so we go back to the importance of the policy discourse in reducing the impact of bad or tough policy choices, even when they are politically difficult to implement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Ali. Nora, would you like to
I'm
add
not going to
anything
comment
there?
on the devaluation since we just went through another one. So I'm not
لسه
sure if
مخرجين
even when people
شوي.
understand the trade-offs that they accept it, they suffer through it. But I'll not share more of the pain on that topic. No, I just want to leave with one remark on this, given what was said by Alia and Faisal, and this is then around that, again, this policy then needs to be very well studied and articulated. And I think that the problem, even when I work, and we work very closely with government on a number of topics, the pressures to implement, to operate, even as nonprofits, the pressures to serve the poor, to serve people in crises, a lot of times means that you make a decision and you put billions of dollars yourself, governments, international financial institutions, and they are not really well studied. And so I think what I would hope to see, a mistake from the past, a mistake from the present, I think something that I think we all collectively recognize, try to implement, but it's really balancing, even for us, we at the organization, as we're investing in more evidence and as we're trying to learn and deploy, we realize that I'm not going to be able to wait for the results of the RCT after 4 years before I work on my poverty program. I have this debate with the researchers from JPAL. I'm like, we need to basically bridge the world of idealism and realism. But I think that there is more that we need to get a little closer to the idealism, at least in terms of design. And so the one example I want to leave, I was very, very happy and very proud that we recently launched with the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development in Egypt, with Community Jamil, with UNICEF, the Egypt Impact Lab, a partnership with JPAL, obviously. And the whole idea was to, bring this adoption by the government of, rigorous evidence, not just one where the government will, collect and publish new evidence, but where it can utilize existing evidence globally that are applicable to the Egyptian context, given that we're spending, Egypt now, obviously in the midst of all this economic reform, we're spending equally also trillions of pounds on social safety nets, on, programs like Haya Karima, decent livelihoods, on other programs that are aimed to support the poor as we go through massive economic reforms. And thus, I think the how well those programs are designed, and I'm grateful that we have a government that recognizes that this is very important and what impact they're going to have. And to what the minister herself said at the launch of the Egypt Impact Lab, then having the agility to change as we go along. So it's okay, maybe we started with a design that's not perfect, but now we're collecting data, we're learning, and we can adapt. It's not just khalas, we designed it, we put 700 trillion EGP, we're going to just implement it the way it is. And so I'm happy to see this, and I hope that there's really a serious adoption of this across the whole spectrum of stakeholders.